Hello, one and all. I'm Scruffy at Scruffy Tales, and you have stumbled upon the War Zone. And like the thumbnail said, in this video we will be taking a look at artillery ammunition production in Scandinavia. And up in the north of Europe, it is Namo, the Nordic ammunition company that is basically on its own producing ammunition. It's a company owned by Norway and Finland, by the countries, state-owned. In Finland, it is owned by Patria, but Patria is a government-owned company. So basically, Norway and Finland, the countries themselves, are in charge of Namo. And they produce, everything that goes boom, basically missiles, small arms ammunition, artillery rounds, anti-tank weapons, hand grenades, ammunition for tanks, you name it, they make it. Rockets, especially, they're big on rockets. And so Namo is one of NATO's most important business partners, as you can imagine. And in Europe, there are 4 companies that are mainly responsible for manufacturing artillery ammunition, and that would be, sorry, the BAE from the UK. We have German Rheinmetall. In France, we have Nexter, and up in the north, in the Nordic countries, we have Namo. And these 4 companies produces in Europe roughly 400,000 to 500,000 artillery shells per year. And that may sound like a lot, but to compare with what happens in Ukraine, who relies on these companies to produce ammunition for them, they spend roughly 2 million artillery shells per year in its defense against the Russian aggression. So if you only produce 500,000 per year in Europe and Ukraine needs 2 million per year to effectively fight the war, you can see that there's some issues with the artillery production currently. Now, a big problem is that Europe doesn't have an unlimited access to explosives, to TNT. And TNT is produced in a single factory in all of Europe, and that factory is in Poland. So with limited access to explosives and having to wait for deliveries, it naturally slows down the overall ability that is already reduced to produce large quantities of artillery shells. And in the middle of all of this, we have this tiny factory in Karlskoga, a small town in the middle of Sweden, right smack in the middle of it. And in Karlskoga, we have a Namo factory, and what they do is they assemble artillery shells. So they receive the various parts from factories in Norway at Raufoss and from Finland from Sastamala. So they all converge in Sweden in Karlskoga, and here they then put everything together to produce artillery shells and other shells as well. But a big part of it is the artillery shells. And this factory has some 130 employees. Not a lot. And as a matter of fact, the demands of Ukraine has forced the factory to step up production. And they recently hired 40 new workers to help them meet these requirements, these demands. So a very small team in the middle of Sweden, has a lot of pressure on them, a lot of weight on their shoulders to keep production going in order to help Ukraine fight this war. But they are kind of going in an uphill battle here in Karlskoga because the factory and the facilities, they are old. They were built in the 70s and 80s, and much of the production process is as old as that. It hasn't really been modernized since it was built. So they're relying on techniques and equipment for production that was high tech in the 70s and 80s. But there's a light at the end of the tunnel. The Swedish government, together with the EU, have gathered a bunch of money, I mean tons of money, that will be invested into the Karlskoga factory to increase artillery shell production. And mainly by updating the factory to more modern standards. Instead of expanding, they will upgrade what's already there. And the hope is that at the end of it, they will be able to increase production capacity by 200%. The downside is that they will reach this new increased capacity in 2 or 3 years from now. So not going to help Ukraine right now, but you know, as time goes on, they're going to be able to push out more and more and more artillery shells that will mainly be shipped down to Ukraine. And a major issue in producing artillery shells is the cooling process. Each shell is filled with liquefied explosives that then have to solidify. And this process takes up to 14 hours per artillery round, right? So Karlskoga has 16 cooling facilities where they have to store all the artillery shells and wait for the liquefied explosives to solidify. But with the additional funding that is just around the corner, they expect to expand from 16 cooling facilities to 32. And this will enable and allow the factory to work 24 hours around the clock, 7 days a week. You just keep pumping out artillery shells as soon as they have these cooling facilities and as soon as they have modernized the production line within the factory. The estimates is that Karlskoga currently produces around 50,000 to 70,000 shells per year. But in order to meet requirements, not only from Ukraine, but from all other customers, at present they would have to produce 800,000 shells per year to supply Ukraine at war and to help out customers that are currently preparing their armed forces for a new arms race against Russia. As of late, in Karlskoga, there has been an increase in unknown drone activity in the area, including, as I understand it, in the airspace above the Namo factory grounds themselves. And I mean, it's safe to assume that these are not operated by unknowing civilians. I mean, clearly these are Russian operated drones that trying to figure out what's going on and if there's a chance to disrupt ammunition production somehow. And that's not the only threat. I mean, if we look at the war itself, Russia is believed to produce 2 million artillery shells per year. I mean, compare that to 500,000 in Europe. And potentially Russia is producing 7 times the total amount of ammunition that the West produces per year. And that's incredible numbers if they are accurate. And keep in mind, Russia is producing that to provide to its own armies. Europe is producing ammo for its own armed forces as well as Ukraine. And Ukraine is not nearly getting enough ammunition that it needs to fight this war. So the threat is real. We may train them, we may provide them with tanks and vehicles and what have you, but if they don't get the ammunition, though all those weapons are useless. For close to 130 years, artillery has reigned supreme on the battlefield, and artillery and indirect fire in general has been responsible for 75% of all casualties in war since the start of the 20th century. In Ukraine, artillery causes 80% of all casualties. So if Ukraine cannot rely on its artillery, it will lose its most important weapon against invaders. Fighter jets, tanks, anti-tank weapons, they all mean nothing if you don't have artillery and enough ammunition for your artillery to hammer the enemy as needed. What we are seeing with Russia pushing as hard as they are at the moment, is pure and simple math. Ukraine will shortly run out of ammunition. Russia will not run out of manpower. Russia will not run out of ammunition. Without ammunition, Ukraine will run out of manpower. As crude and sinister as it may seem, it is a very logical approach. Russia forces Ukraine to spend more ammo than it can afford. And Russia can afford losing insane amounts of casualties because it has an endless supply of soldiers. If nothing changes, and changes soon, a Russian victory appears unavoidable. Simply because Russian leaders and commanders are such brutal savages that they don't care how they win. They don't care how many soldiers die or how many civilians die. They will increase the slaughter until Ukraine runs out of ammunition, and in the end, until they run out of soldiers. And the only way to prevent it is if Europe and North America and the world decides to do more for Ukraine. A lot more. And that's all I have for you this time around. And before we call it quits, I would like to quote Stalin to remind us all just how Russia views casualties in war. A single death is a tragedy. A million deaths are a statistic. That's it. See you around. Gå på marsch, Ukraine. Give them hell.